Reading Chapter 6 of The Great Wheel by Robert Lawson. Chapter 6. Here's a picture of G.W.G. Ferris. It was late the next evening when they disembarked in Chicago. Theirs had not been a fast train. Stiff, sore, and sleepy, Con received only a vague impression of the city, for Uncle Patrick herded them onto various clanging streetcars which clattered and banged and bumped a circuitous way to the far outskirts, a region of dimly lit, rutted streets, scattered in ramshackle buildings. Their boarding house was larger and less decrepit than its neighbors. It was wrapped in a steamy aroma of simmering prunes and corned beef and cabbage, but it was moderately clean and blissfully warm. Uncle Patrick was boisterously greeted by the landlady, Mrs. Murphy, by her husband, 3 dogs, and a half-dozen cats. "Sure, it's a happy evening sees you back, Mr. Giblin," Mrs. Murphy cried. "Though we're woeful cramped for space. Your nephew, now, and the wee man can share your room, if you've no objection, but I'm afraid the others will have to put up with the bunkhouse we made out in the old stable." "Plenty good enough for uncouth foreigners like of them," Uncle Patrick roared. "The height of elegance compared to a ship's forecastle or the East River rat holes they're used to." Mr. Murphy fetched a lantern and led Scrimer and the 2 grinning Norwegians out to the back premises. "'Tis not the Palmer house, nor yet a grand apartment like your Uncle Michael's," Uncle Patrick yawned as they prepared for bed, "but it's close to the work, and it's fortunate we are to have any place at all, the way workmen have gathered here from the 4 corners of the nation to be working on the fair buildings and grounds. Come spring and the visitors begin arriving, Mrs. Murphy will doubtless be renting cots on her front stoop for the price of a bridal suite at the Waldorf Astoria." He transferred 2 of Mrs. Murphy's cats from his bed to Martin Brennan's. "Here, little man, is a couple of fur neck pieces for you. I grow my own." He laughed as he combed out his red beard. "And welcome it'll be on that windswept bit of prairie thereafter naming the Great White City." Con was not greatly impressed by his first sight of the fairgrounds. Here's a picture of it. Except as a scene of the most colossal confusion. Some of the great buildings were completed and rose proudly in the gleaming whiteness of ornate plaster and stucco. Others were half-finished, gaunt ribs of steel and timber cutting against the cold winter sky. Piles of lumber were scattered everywhere over ridges and mounds of frozen earth. Smoke rose from hundreds of small fires around which groups of workmen warmed themselves. Massive statuary groups, their frail plaster of Paris covered by canvas, perched on flimsy-looking wooden legs. Elaborate bridges spanned non-existent canals. Mule teams by the hundreds struggled to haul dump carts and drays over the frozen ruts and hummocks. Despite the cold, the frozen earth, and the biting wind from Lake Michigan, the work was going forward. The sound of hammers and saws, the chatters of riveters, and the monotonous cursing of the teamsters merged in an unceasing chorus. As they stumbled over the uneven path, Uncle Patrick explained a few of the features of the confused scene. "That long structure over there, looking like a cavern, will be the Palace of Science and Industry when and if it's finished," he shouted. "That one, the Fine Arts Building. That other, the Transportation Building. These swampy hollows will be lakes and lagoons, beautified with statuary and fountains. Columbus and Venus rising from the foam, Tritons, Neptunes, and mermaids by the dozen. Come spring, these blasted mountains of frozen prairie muck will be made into beautiful green lawns planted with rare and exotic plants and shrubbery." "Likely," jeered Scrimer, "a regular Hyde Park, I don't think." "And this," went on Uncle Patrick as they pricked their way along a path between 2 rows of assorted half-finished structures, "will be the great Midway. There will be shooting galleries, beer gardens, and sideshows and villages of every variety of strange and savage foreigners. Japanese, Filipinos, Indians, Fijis, Egyptians, Eskimos." "Why don't they bring them along?" Scrimer interrupted. "Eskimos might feel at home in this blinking climate. There will be a German village, an Irish village, a bit of old Vienna, maybe even a Cockney slum. Scrimer, me lad, with its disgusting inhabitants in their native habitat. And straight ahead of us, dominating the whole scene, will rise the magnificent Ferris wheel, the shining wonder of the century." There certainly was no shining wonder visible at the moment, Con thought, only a few laborers digging a hole. A small derrick was hauling up scoops of black prairie soil and emptying them into a line of waiting dump carts. The gang boss hailed Uncle Patrick, and they all paused to peer into the hole, now about 10 feet deep. "Have you struck gold yet, Danny?" Uncle Patrick laughed. "We have not," the boss answered. "We've struck ice, and we've struck mud. We've struck water, and we've struck quicksand. Everything but the bones of a dinosaur, and I'm expecting them any minute now." "Well, you'd best be putting in some decent shoring there, or you'll be having a cave-in and burying the bones of a lot of good Irishmen," Uncle Patrick said, frowning. "You may have to go down 50 feet by the looks of it to strike a solid base. We can't be setting a couple 1,000 tons of steel on a foundation floating on quicksand. What's more, there's 7 more of these holes to be dug, and Mr. Ferris wants to be pouring concrete in a week or 2. "Pour concrete?" Danny protested. "How can anybody pour concrete, let alone mix it in this weather, it cold enough to freeze the marrow bones in a boiling stew pot?" "Leave that to me and Mr. Ferris, and get on with your digging," Uncle Patrick said. He led his charges to a large shack built of corrugated iron and tar paper. Inside was one large shed-like room where many draftsmen bent over tables covered with blueprints. Despite 3 huge glowing stoves, they all wore hats and overcoats. A middle-aged man hurried over and greeted Uncle Patrick cordially, but in a lowered voice. He pointed to the far corner where 3 men were engaged in conversation. "The boss is busy right now, Pat," he said, "but he'll be glad you're back. They're talking money. We're still short $100,000, but this looks promising. The fat one with the fur collar is Zilmer, the big meat packer, rolling in it. The skinny one is Peabody, his lawyer and financial man. So the third one must be the famous George Washington Gale Ferris," Con thought, looking at him with interest. He did not appear especially unusual or impressive. Of medium size, well but quietly dressed, and rather young, in his mid-30s, Con guessed, although a heavy mustache made him look somewhat older. The only striking thing about him were his keen, piercing, deep-set eyes and his air of quiet but absolute confidence. If he was to be telling you the world was square, you'd be believing him, and he'd be right, likely, Con thought. Con's eyes fell on an elaborate construction of steel and wire on a nearby table. He nudged Uncle Patrick. "What is the squirrel cage yonder?" he asked. Uncle Patrick rose and led him and Martin Brennan over to it. "That, me boy," he said, "is an exact scale model of the great wheel we're about to construct. These wee bug-like things scattered around represent people. The little doll houses are those great buildings we just passed outside, so you can judge the magnitude of it." "I can see plain what you meant about it being like a bicycle wheel," Con said. "The thin spokes of it and all. It looks strong, too." "It is indeed," Uncle Patrick said, placing his great hand on the wheel. "As you can well see, it has 2 rims, one 30 feet inside of the other. Those 2 rims will be joined by girders and braces the like of a truss bridge, making it that strong you could take it off its 2 towers and roll it off across the prairie were you so minded, and had the strength." The engineer who had greeted them turned to Martin Brennan. "We have some pretty husky work laid out for you, Brennan," he said. "This axle, for one thing, it will be 45 feet long, 33 inches in diameter, the largest piece of steel ever forged in America. It will weigh something over 46 tons and must be hoisted and placed in its bearings on top of those 2 towers. That's a lift of 141 feet from the ground. Can it be done?" The little man studied the model thoughtfully for a few moments. "Give me the materials and a couple of small donkey engines, and I'll lay it in its bearings as easy and gentle as you'd be putting a sleeping babe in the arms of its nurse," he said placidly. "Good," the engineer laughed. "You have a confidence equal to Mr. Ferris's. He'll like you." They immediately plunged into a complicated discussion of cables, blocks, tackles, and weights and strains, while Con continued to study the model of the gray wheel. He was so absorbed that he failed to notice the approach of Mr. Ferris and his 2 companions until Uncle Patrick hastily pulled him aside. As they passed, the boss gave Uncle Patrick a broad grin and a wink. Mr. Zilmer certainly looked rich, Con thought. Everything about him spelled money. The fur-lined overcoat, the large pearl stick pin in the brocaded ascot tie, the gold-headed walking stick, and the heavy gold watch chain stretched across his ample paunch. Even the cigar that seemed grown into his ruddy face smelled expensive. Hands clasped behind his back, The pork king stared fixedly at the model, completely oblivious to Mr. Peabody's excited protests. "But Mr. Ferris," the latter was saying, "the thing's impossible, ridiculous. Everyone I've talked to says it can't be done. Even if you should get it built by some miracle, who would ever be idiotic enough to take a chance on riding it? Do you mean to tell me that sensible, responsible American people are going to pay good money to risk their lives on any such contraption as this?" "I do," Mr. Ferris replied with a smile. "About 15,000 of them a day." "Absurd," snapped Mr. Peabody. "There ain't that many fools in the country. The thing is bound to be a financial failure. You are proposing to spend $400,000, almost $500,000, on this wild idea. You can't possibly get it built before the fair is half over, if at all. Even if you should, and there are a few fools willing to ride in it, you can't make back all that money in a few weeks." Mr. Ferris continued to smile. "Here are the facts and figures, Mr. Peabody," he said quietly. "I will have the wheel completed, tested, and ready for business between the 15th and 20th of June. Except for the committee's dilly-dallying, which has cost us 6 weeks, it would have been ready on May 1st, the opening day. However, June 20th will give us slightly over 4 months to operate. 128 days, to be exact. We should average at least 15,000 passengers per day. At 50 cents each, that will mean $7,500 each day. 128 days, therefore, will bring in a total of $960,000, more than double the cost of the wheel. Deducting that original cost and our operating expenses, which will not be great, leaves at least $400,000, or a profit of 100%. I would consider that a rather handsome return. If you get the passengers, and if the fool thing doesn't collapse, and if there are no accidents," shouted Mr. Peabody, "and a dozen other ifs. But how can you prove all these figures? What guarantees can you give?" Here's the three of them arguing. Mr. Ferris ceased to smile as he replied, "My word, Mr. Peabody, my word and my experience and my professional reputation, all of which are rather important to me. You must realize, as I certainly do, that if I have made the slightest error in any of my calculations, if there should be a mechanical failure of any kind, I would face complete ruin. I could never again find employment in the engineering profession, even to sharpen pencils. At every revolution of this wheel, 1,000 or more men, women, and children will be entrusting their lives to the accuracy of my figures. That, to me, is a far heavier responsibility than any matter of dollars." "That's all very well," Mr. Peabody began, but Mr. Zillmer finally removed his gaze from the model and plucked the cigar from his mouth, rather in the manner of extracting a cork from a bottle. He silenced his advisor with a glance. "All the success I've had," the pork magnate said, "has come from doing what everybody else said was impossible. How much more money do you need, Mr. Ferris?" $100,000. "Good, I'll take it. Shut up, Peabody. And one other thing, Mr. Ferris. I'd like to be a passenger on the first trip." Mr. Ferris again smiled his youthful grin. "On the first official trip, you will certainly be, Mr. Zillmer, but I am afraid not on the very first trip. You see, in the case of every tunnel or bridge I have built, Mrs. Ferris and I have always made the first trip, alone. It's just an idea of ours, somewhat like the old-time royal food taster. As you know, he always took the first bite or sip to make sure the dish contained no poison. We are the tasters for my constructions, and so far, I'm glad to say, none of them has contained poison." Mr. Zillmer barked a short sea lion laugh. "The same with the missus and me too," he said. "We have for dinner first every new Zillmer product. If it's no good, it's out. I stake my word and my reputation on every Zillmer product. That's why people trust fellows like you and me. Good luck, Mr. Ferris. You'll have a check as soon as Peabody gets over his indigestion. I'm sending you a Zillmer ham too, and there won't anybody have to taste it first." As soon as his visitors had left, Mr. Ferris hastened over and clapped Uncle Patrick happily on the back. "Good to see you, Pat," he cried. "At last we are straight financially and ready to go full steam ahead. And I see you have shanghaied some recruits from New York?" "I have indeed," Uncle Patrick replied, proudly introducing Martin Brennan and his crew. "The wee fellow here is a genius, I'm told. A master rigger, 5 years in the best shipyards of Belfast, 8 months with a web in New York. He vouches for the 2 boxheads, and, judging by the size of them, they ought to serve us of use. A couple of derricks, anyway. Scrimer there, the Duke of Limehouse, May not look like much, but he can put a running splice in steel cable so smooth you could be running your cheek over it and getting no more of a scratch than you would from a greased banana. Welcome, gentlemen, Mr. Ferris said. Mr. Baldwin will take you over with tears of joy. He's been screaming for good riggers for 2 weeks now. And what about the young man, Pap? I seem to see a slight family resemblance there. My nephew, Uncle Patrick announced, Cornelius Terence Kilroy. I have just rescued him from my brother, who is all for making a lily-handed, pasty-faced clerk out of him. He's had some little experience in excavation, drainage, and concrete, and what he doesn't know, I'll teach him, fast. Beginning at once, Mr. Ferris said. Pat, I want you to take over those foundations. Danny isn't getting anywhere with them. Now that the money is assured, I will wire all the steel companies to go into high gear. Our tower steel will be coming through very shortly, and we'll have to have something to set it on. I would like to start pouring concrete a week from today. You will strike solid bottom at 35 feet, which means that you have about 5,000 cubic yards of muck to excavate. You fly at it. Yes, sir, Uncle Patrick said with a happy grin. You can begin to pour in 6 days, or my name is Zilmer. Come, Con, me lad. This is no fiddling sewer ditch. You've got a man's job now.